Hello, everyone. Welcome to Word on Wednesdays Live, where we hold the Bible to be the very Word of God, the authority to which we subordinate all other authorities. It's good to be with you tonight. A little bit of back and forth on the weather, right? Had a friend post a picture where it was like a lamb, and then March was like a lion, and then suddenly it was like a lamb, and then it was like a lion, then it was like a lamb, then it was like a lion, and at the end she had a dinosaur with a question mark. Is it going to be like that? Who knows? Anyway, good to be with you. I have done so far 3 different lessons looking at the supposed evidence for human evolution. Much more could be done, of course. There's a number of things we haven't touched on. We haven't touched on the Australopithecus afarensis. We haven't talked about Neanderthal and the questions there, Cro-Magnon and other kinds of things, other Homo habilis we've only maybe touched a little bit on. We've talked about Homo erectus and so forth. I had initially planned to do a lot more about this, but we have been doing the subject of origins and the creation-evolution debate back and forth for quite some time now. We've covered a variety of topics, subheadings, you might say, underneath that main heading. And I'd like to move on to other things soon. I'm concerned about burning people out on this particular topic. I still have a couple of things that I will springboard off of the subject on human origins, and I'd like to wrap it up with some of those. So tonight, let's take a look at a topic you may have seen somewhere along the way in your science education in junior high, high school, or in college. And maybe you'll recognize some things tonight as we talk about them. I was actually reminded of this particular subject for the night as I prepared for last week's lesson. If you remember, we studied the story of Java Man and his discoverer, Eugene Dubois. And as I was reading up on Dubois from his Wikipedia article online, I found the sentence that you see there, where it says, "Nevertheless, Dubois' chief interest was in human evolution, influenced by Ernst Hagel. To prove all of them right by finding the missing link between apes and humans." Now, at one point in my life, I was doing a good bit of reading up on Ernst Haeckel and listening to people talk about him. Fascinating kind of subject, actually, in this whole debate. And I guess I was first introduced to this man by creationist speaker Kent Hovind, who had a very well-done seminar on the subject of creation and evolution, had access to the set of seminar, 6 or 7 VHS tapes, one on each topic that he covered, and the neat thing about it was he had no copyright on his stuff. He said, "I have no copyright on this." He says, the purpose is to get the word out. Take this, make copies, distribute it to your friends, etc., etc. And so I, made myself a copy off of something that I had there originally and just watched them to death. I discovered Hovind's seminar back in the mid to late 90s, I guess. And he covered it so thoroughly. He did such a fine job with that. Hovind talked during the course of that about Ernst Haeckel and his primary idea, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. There you go. We'll talk about that much more in a little bit. Try to define it for you, and maybe you'll recognize the concept even though you may not know that phrase. Although you might. I've run into people who remember it based on that phrase alone because they like the way the words tumble off their tongue. I learned more about Haeckel's work from this book, Icons of Evolution, Science or Myth, by Jonathan Wells, the guy featured there in the center, of course. And I'd come across his book in the early 2000s, after we knew that Y2K was not going to be an issue, everything was okay. A lot of what we'll look at today is going to come from Dr. Wells' chapter on Haeckel. So, okay, who was Ernst Haeckel? He was a German zoologist, a naturalist, a eugenicist, which is an interesting term. He was a philosopher, a physician, a professor. He was a marine biologist and an artist. Sounds a little bit like Leonardo da Vinci or somebody. Wikipedia says that Haeckel promoted and popularized Charles Darwin's work in Germany and developed the influential but no longer widely held recapitulation theory, which is just another name for ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, claiming, this is what this claims, that an individual organism's biological development, or ontogeny, parallels and summarizes its species' evolutionary development, or phylogeny. So we'll get into that and a little bit more later. You probably still don't know quite what that means, but maybe you're getting a better idea. Yes, Haeckel promoted and he popularized Darwin's idea about the evolution of species throughout Germany, which I find really interesting. He was born in 1834. Now, Darwin published his book on the origin of species in 1859, and so that places Haeckel at just the right youthful age to become Darwin's evangelist in Germany, and he also spoke throughout Europe as well. In fact, he became known as Darwin's bulldog. He was tenacious and didn't let up. Noticing there that Haeckel was an artist, there was something else in Wikipedia's biography of him that kind of caught my eye. It said there, the published artwork of Haeckel includes over 100 detailed, multicolor illustrations of animals and sea creatures collected in his Kunstformen der Natur, or Art Forms of Nature, a book which would go on to influence the Art Nouveau artistic movement. I didn't have any idea of this till I was studying this out today. I guess it interested me in part because here's the thing. I am a firm believer in the axiom that ideas have consequences. Ideas have consequences. What people believe directly impacts their motivation in life, and it leads inevitably to the actions that they take. What a person believes influences their values. What they value determines their decisions, and their decisions, of course, influence their actions, right? And then other people's actions as well, and there's that interplay and everything else. So ideas have consequences. Ideas have influence. And here we have a book of scientific illustrations, Ernst Haeckel's Art Forms in Nature, which became very popular in certain art circles in France, in Paris, and so forth. Now you see on the book cover there the subspecies of jellyfish known as Discomedusae. Discomedusae. The Medusa is in the middle of that. I don't know if you caught that or not, but Medusa was that Greek demigod or whatever that had snakes for hair, and anybody she looked at turned to stone, right? And I guess all those tentacles coming off that jellyfish kind of look like Medusa or snaky hair or something like that. So, and then there's disco, which I figure Medusa's at the disco and turning, John Travolta and others just into stone on Saturday Night Fever. Anyway, it's kind of like they went from disco to rock. Well, never mind. The tentacles reminded Haeckel of his late wife's hair. I don't know whether she thought that was such a great thing or not, but that's what I was told. And on the right side of the slide there, you see his drawings of bats. This is a page from his work where he shows bats from different angles, different kinds of bats, and so on and so forth. And we see the efforts here, then, of an evolutionist / scientist, artist, and Darwinian promoter who is impacting the efforts of artists who that's what they do for a living. I don't know how much interest they have in science, maybe a lot, but they're really intrigued by his drawings, and so it influences them. The poster on the right there was done by Alphonse Mucha of the Art Nouveau school. Now, Haeckel's beliefs thus converted these artists to his views. You see, ideas have consequences, and how they get out and what they do influences other people. And his influence on them was their artistic stylings. This is another Alphonse Mucha work. I found that I kept being attracted to his, not knowing it was him. I'd look at a drawing and say, oh, that one really looks pretty cool, and I'd find out it's this guy, so I must like his stuff. I don't know. But anyway, thus we see humanism and an atheistic philosophy finding its expression in art that came out of the late 19th and the early 20th centuries. This is an example of Art Nouveau architecture here. And I really was intrigued by this. That door there reminds me of Haeckel's drawings of the bat faces. Can you sort of see the connection I'm making there with some of the bats on the other side? The two ovals at the top of the door, the windows there and down the sides, and the symmetry especially is what's really good. Haeckel did very well in his drawing of the bats and other things in capturing the symmetry found in nature. The balance, that the right side looks like the left side. And from what I've shown you here, we can see that same emphasis on symmetry, a balance between left and right, showing up in the Art Nouveau artists. Just go back through here once. There's a balance on that one, on both sides. You can tell by the thing behind her. I can't see the picture real well here, but there's kind of a symmetry to that, and on this one as well, a little bit more obvious with balance on either side, and that seems, with the flowing and everything else, kind of natural moves of the form, but balanced on either side. And so yeah, that symmetry is a key factor, I think, in this art form. Don't know much about it really, but nonetheless, and it's kind of ironic really that he captured this. It's a striking irony, and I say it's ironic because the symmetry of nature, the balance in nature, is evidence that life has been designed, implying a designer behind all of it. And yet Haeckel actively promoted Darwinism, the very antithesis of intelligent design, claiming that everything happened by random chance. Pardon the deliberate pun here, but Haeckel hacked into the creator God's designer template. He took that design element and he used that design to promote an anti-creator philosophy and belief system, to say everything arose out of chaos and disorder. It's crazy. More importantly for our purposes, some of Haeckel's art later got him into academic hot water, and we'll see some of that in a little while. Also, from Wikipedia's bio of Haeckel, we read this. Haeckel was also a promoter of scientific racism and embraced the idea of social Darwinism. Now this turns out to be a big deal. A very big deal. He's in Germany, and we'll get into that more next week. We don't have time to hit all that tonight, but it should be an interesting study next week as we continue some of this. We'll return to Ernst Hagel himself momentarily. For a few moments here, I want to introduce something else, bring in another concept, something that came around well before Darwin. Okay, this was called the Great Chain of Being. The Great Chain of Being. And this Great Chain of Being artificially organized the order of creation. It has nothing to do with evolution necessarily. It's describing the order that people believed the creation or nature itself fell into. And it's important, though, to note this would not be creation as we understand it from the Bible. I have a feeling that this order came to us, this great chain of being came to us through the influence of the Catholic Church. That doesn't mean that it was biblical back in those days. I'm going to let Marvin Lubenow explain some of this. He said to step back into the 19th century would cause us culture shock in many ways, and I believe that's true. One of the shocks would come when we realized what was commonly believed about creation. Before evolution became popular, so you're kind of in the first half of the 19th century, 1800 to 1850 or whatever, creation was the accepted scientific model of the universe and of humans. However, it was a type of creation that few of us would recognize, and no biblical creationist would endorse. The concept was known as the great chain of being, patterned not after Moses, but after Plato, the Greek philosopher. According to this concept, the Almighty had created a great ladder or chain of living things. And that's kind of what you see in that image there. I know the image is really difficult to see the details, but the details really aren't nearly as important as the structure you see there. It looks almost like a layer cake or something, or a stack of plates of some kind, stack of pancakes maybe. We had a recent pancake breakfast, but you can see the stepwise progress of things going up and getting more crowded, more complex as it moves toward the top of the picture. All right, this is that great chain of being. So you can see the ladder concept there. From single-celled organisms all the way up to humans, each organism being a little more complex than the one below it. All of nature fit into this ascending organizational scale, like the keys on a piano. Each organism was discrete, but a bit higher in the organization and more complex than the one below it. Just as there are no missing keys on a piano, there could be no spaces or gaps in this ladder. Read no extinction. This great chain of being looked much like an evolutionary progression, but it was static. You didn't move from one level to the next like evolution would teach. You had stasis. You remained, you stayed where you were. Each organism was created by the Almighty in its particular slot and did not evolve upward. Since any imperfections in nature would be a reflection upon the work of the Almighty, it was further believed that nature was perfect. Now you start to see some of the problems there theologically. He says this idea was obviously in conflict with the biblical account of the fall of man into sin in Genesis 3 and its results on nature. God placed a curse on everything. Further, this theory implied that extinction was impossible because that would indicate that the Almighty did not take proper care of his creatures after he had created them. These ideas were in conflict then with the Noahic flood in Genesis 6 to 9, where the whole purpose of the flood as a judgment from God was to destroy the world as it then was. 2 Peter 3:6. It is obvious, Lubenow concludes, that in the great chain of being, we are dealing not with biblical concepts, but with pagan Greek philosophy. The ideas there belong to the Greeks, the pagan Greeks, about the perfection of nature and so forth, the ideal man that they searched for and idealized, in their culture and society. All of that kind of thing. They took nature to be perfect in its ways and its consequences and everything else. And as I said earlier, ideas, they have their consequences. They play out in certain ways. I want you to recall this line that comes from Satan from Genesis chapter 3 in the fall. You will be like God, knowing good and evil. You'll know good and evil for yourselves. You'll be your own gods. You'll be just like him. That's an idea. And it certainly had its consequences. From that moment, a satanic ideology permeated human thinking. Like a foul stench will fill the air, no matter how much pine scent you spray in the room. Corrupt thinking, corrupt philosophy, fallen reasoning lingers, set to return at any moment. In 1 Kings 11, in verse 3 there, it tells us that King Solomon's pagan wives turned away his heart. We have a pagan lingering odor there in the temple that he had built in Jerusalem. And it came to dominance. Essentially the same pagan pantheon of gods and goddesses worshipped by the Canaanites, such as the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Edomites, the Sidonians, and the Hittites, were likewise worshipped by the Sumerians, worshipped by the Ugaritic people, the same gods and goddesses, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Medes, the Persians, the Egyptians, the Philistines. All of them worshipped basically the same gods and goddesses, different names, different stories, but there were obviously comparable stories where the same story was told in a different culture, and all kinds of things like that. But basically it was all following the same thing. All of Israel's pagan neighbors worshiped basically the same gods and goddesses. Remember, ideas have consequences. The Greeks worshiped them, so did the Romans. And through the Roman Catholic Church, Greek and Roman philosophy likewise began to permeate the thinking of Western Europe. And it influences the Renaissance when that occurs in Southern Europe. Thus arose out of all this, in part, this idea of the great chain of being. Now understand, of course, this chain of being idea is not in any way, shape, or form truth at all, right? It was a corrupted hybrid of largely pagan thought and some general notions and motifs based loosely upon stuff that was read in the Bible. Now look especially here at the chart on the right in this slide that I borrowed from somebody. Entities on the different levels of being have different levels of intelligence. Look, God himself is pure intelligence, right? Angels have pure intelligence. It was given to them by God, according to this idea. Okay. Now, Renaissance thinking, it's called the Renaissance chain of being there. You'll see that. And Renaissance thinking, as I said, was heavily influenced by pagan Greek philosophy. And I want you to notice something here. Take a look at those red arrows that I put on the chart, okay? Notice especially there the difference that was thought to exist between the two different classes of human society. The nobles, the elites, have been blessed with higher intelligence, right? But the commoners merely are capable of intelligence, common sense, blah, blah, blah. If you think that that attitude no longer exists in our modern culture today, well, then you really haven't been paying attention, friend. For example, you might have missed it when a famous politician referred to a large segment of American society as deplorables. Les déplorables. I guess that's how you would say that. I don't know. And think of the number of people in power from the realms of politics and also from the entertainment world, also from academia and so forth, who over the last couple of years have demonstrated that things, ordinances like mask requirements and so forth, really don't apply to them. And other things. Don't gather together in small groups, but since nobody's in the restaurant, let's have my birthday party there, said the governor or something, whatever it was. See, they believe that they are more highly evolved than the rest of us. They're further up that chain of being, except now we're talking about evolution, see. Consider this quote that I found from American physicist and entrepreneur Richard Griffith Seed, who forced a national debate on human cloning back in the 1990s. Look at what he says here. We are going to become gods. period. You shall be as God, knowing right and wrong from yourselves, says Satan, a fallen angel. This guy, right in line. He goes on, if you don't like that, get off. Get off my planet. You don't have to contribute, you don't have to participate, but if you're going to interfere with me becoming a god, you're going to have trouble. There will be warfare. Whoa. I'm really threatened there, Mr. Seed. Mr. Seed has an ironic last name there, as we're speaking of ironies tonight. I am reminded of the foundational verse on spiritual warfare that comes to us from the book of Genesis. And I will put enmity, God says to the serpent, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed, which could just be this guy right here, Mr. Seed, I don't know, and her seed, capital S, and he shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. So if Mr. Seed, Richard Seed, is serious about this warfare he speaks of, well, then I'm very glad that I'm on the side of the seed of the woman, the Lord Jesus Christ. Ideas have consequences, so I beg you, choose you this day whom you will serve. Things are heating up, friends. Choose you this day whom you will serve. This great chain of being idea obviously eventually becomes the model upon which the infamous evolutionary tree is based, as you see here. The ladder of life from an evolutionary standpoint, or the really fancy term that I've got there for you, the phylogenetic tree of life. Take note that Charles Darwin is at the very top of the tree there by my red arrow, representing all of humanity. Isn't it great we have such a noble representative for us all? Anyway, phylogenesis simply means the evolutionary development of a species, how a species evolved over millions of years, what it went through, all the different stages that it went through and everything else. Genesis, of course, means beginning, and philo means race or tribe or kind. So the beginning of a race, the beginning of a tribe, the beginning of a kind of animal or creature or whatever. Phylogenesis then refers to the origin of a species. Basically, that's the title of Charles Darwin's book, Origin of Species, right? Returning now to our good friend Ernst Hagel, we have seen, just to kind of review here, that during the latter part of the 19th century, Haeckel became an enthusiastic promoter of Darwinian evolution in his home nation of Germany. He's going all over the country to anybody who will listen and telling them all about Darwinism and how great it is and how we need to throw everything we have in our country behind it, etc., etc., etc. And he used his artistic talent to draw all kinds of different examples of kinds of life, all manner of organisms from all over the spectrum of that great chain of being that we've been talking about, right? And he also believed that there were missing links, a term that he invented, missing links in the chain from apes to humans, which made a big impact on Eugene Dubois and his search for a missing link on the island of Java. Haeckel also came up with the idea that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. Don't tune me out yet, hang in there. I like this little phrase because if you can memorize that kind of rhythmic patter you've got there, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, you can sound really smart. The trouble with it is it's a bogus idea, but most of the people you talk to won't know that, and so you can sound smart. So what do these big, expensive words here, which when totaled together, actually add up to the dollar amount of the average gallon of gas today, so you know they're expensive. What do these big, expensive words mean exactly? Well, we've already talked about phylogeny a little bit. It's basically the stages that a species has evolved through to become what it is today, if you believe that theory. Now, when it comes to recapitulate, well, you know what a recap is, right? It's a rehearsing of some information. It's a going through again of the steps or the stages of something. A moment ago, I just recapped for you 3 things that we've learned this evening about Ernst Haeckel. You turn on the sports report, and you can often get a recap of the game that you missed. The sportscaster rehearsing the game's highlights for you, when the teams scored and so forth. So we got those two words. It leaves the one term there, ontogeny. And Wikipedia says ontogeny is the origination and development of an organism, a single individual organism, usually from the time of fertilization of the egg to adult. So it's like the stages of embryonic development of, say, a chicken inside of an egg, or a baby in its mother's womb until it's ready to be born, and then we follow it from there. Put all of this together. Ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, and we find that the idea of ontogeny recapitulating phylogeny basically says that when an organism goes through its stages of embryonic development, ontogeny, it actually recaps or goes through the same stages of evolutionary development that its particular species went through over millions of years. In other words, if this recap idea is true, then all biologists have to do to study evolution is to study the development of individual organisms in the womb, or in the egg, or in the cocoon, or whatever. This, you see, was Ernst Haeckel's big contribution. Ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. It's his philosophy, whatever. Although he thought it was a fact. Now, here is a set of 24 drawings to illustrate what's actually happening when ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. What you have here are representations of 3 stages of development, 3 stages each of the embryonic development. You got 3 rows there. Okay, you have 3 rows, and then you have it's the embryonic development of 8 different kinds of organisms. So you have 3 columns up and down. Okay, you have a fish, a salamander column, a tortoise, a chick, a hog, a calf, a rabbit, and a human. Now look especially, if you will, at that very top row, showing the earliest stages for each one of these. Take a look there. Why, they all look almost exactly the same. Isn't that astounding? Who knew that the embryos of fish and salamanders and tortoises and chickens and hogs and cows and rabbits and humans, who knew that their early embryos all look so much alike in that early stage of development? That's just simply amazing. Now, I imagine that some of you may well have seen this kind of imagery somewhere before. Most likely you saw it in a textbook from school or from college, or maybe on a film strip or something, or a slideshow presentation, the old slides that they used to have where every time it was time to change, the record would go boop and you change the slide or something. Anyway, well, for example, with textbooks, here's a page from Raven and Johnson's biology textbook published by McGraw-Hill back in 1999. The resolution isn't so good here. You can't really read any of the words. But you can see the forms of the early embryos of 5 different organisms over there on the left column. 5 going from top to bottom. There's a fish, salamander, a tortoise. You can see the shell over there at his final stage on his little back. And then there's a chicken and a human. And again, look at that first column. They all look remarkably similar. Okay, now there's a few things that I haven't told you yet about this. First, there's those 24 drawings that I showed you earlier. I got a little thumbnail in there. The black and white ones, right? They were drawn. I didn't tell you this, but they were drawn by our good friend Ernst Hagel, Darwin's bulldog. He drew these. Now you can tell that this 1999 textbook's drawings on the left there are clearly based on Haeckel's drawings from more than 100 years earlier. Wow, if he's got them back that far and they've got them in 1999, 100 years later or more, well, then they must be right? They're in books. Well, the other thing, though, that I didn't tell you yet is Haeckel's drawings are all fraudulent. They're frauds. In his book, Icons of Evolution, that I showed you earlier this evening, Dr. Jonathan Wells says this: Haeckel produced many drawings of vertebrate, that means you have a backbone, right? Vertebrate embryos to illustrate his biogenetic law, the recapitulation law. The drawings show vertebrate embryos that look very much alike at their earliest stage, which we noted. In fact, the embryos looked too much alike. According to historian Jane Oppenheimer, Haeckel's quote, hand as an artist altered what he saw with what should have been the eye of a more accurate beholder. He was more than once, often justifiably, accused of scientific falsification by Wilhelm His and many others, end quote. In some cases, Wells goes on, Haeckel used the same woodcut to print embryos that were supposedly from different classes. So as he's going across the top there or across the side, he's basically got a stamp. Poom, 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 all look the same. In others, he says Haeckel doctored his drawings to make the embryos appear more alike than they really were. Haeckel's contemporaries, people who lived at the same time and looked at his work, repeatedly criticized him for these misrepresentations, and charges of fraud abounded in his lifetime. Please take note of that. Whether or not Haeckel was guilty of fraud, that is, deliberate deception, there is no doubt that his drawings misrepresent vertebrate embryos. First, he chose only those embryos that came closest to fitting his theory. That's called selective reasoning or something, right? Although there are 7 classes of vertebrates, jawless fish, cartilaginous fishes. That's basically like sharks. They don't have bones, they have cartilage. Bony fishes, who do have bones. Amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. Haeckel showed only 5 on his, omitting jawless and those cartilaginous shark fish entirely. Furthermore, to represent amphibians, he used a salamander rather than a frog, which looks very different. Finally, half of his embryos are mammals, and all of these are from one order, placentals, where you have a womb and the baby is in the placenta developing and so forth. Other mammalian orders, like egg-laying monotremes, the duckbill platypus, and pouch-brooding marsupials, the kangaroo, are omitted. He doesn't put them in there. If this is a theory for all of evolution of life, it should apply to all individual species, right? Thus, Haeckel began with a biased sample. He's already in trouble. So once again, we've been lied to by evolutionists, folks. And like I said a moment ago, this lie has perpetuated down through history. Lie or not, ideas have consequences. You shall be as gods. I'm going to be a god, get out of my way. Ideas have consequences, true or not. I remember seeing that human embryo in its early stage. I remember being told that that embryo actually had gill slits like a fish, like we all had gills at one time when we were in our mother's wombs. Haeckel's drawings were the basis for what I was being told about those gill slits. But his drawings were wholly inaccurate. Maybe they were drawn wrong on purpose, changed to support his idea. Maybe he got so enthusiastic, kind of like the Jane, what's her name, Oppenheimer was saying, that he just got excited and drew something he really didn't see. because it wanted it to fit his idea so badly. And as I've shown you, this information showed up in a 1999 McGraw-Hill school textbook. And this is the thing. Drawings, obviously based directly on Haeckel's original false drawings from the late 1800s, were in a 1999 textbook over 100 years later, and the lie is still being perpetuated, you see. Now, I personally had been out of high school for 22 years by that time, but I saw them in my biology book in 10th grade. I remember seeing these pictures. Here's another example. This one is from Joseph Raver's Biology, Patterns and Processes of Life. It was published by J.M. Liebel, was published by J.M. Liebel in 2004. Now, although Haeckel's recapitulation ideas aren't discussed in the text of this book, you see the drawings at the bottom of the page there, on the bottom left of that page. The caption below those drawings, accompanying those four of Haeckel's early embryos, the caption says, we can't read it here, all vertebrate embryos closely resemble one another in early development. All vertebrate embryos closely resemble one another in early development. This implies that all animals with a backbone share a common ancestor. All of them, kangaroos and duckbill platypuses included. What you see here, this page, this appeared in a rough draft, okay, that was given to the Texas State Board of Education for approval in 2003. Had the Texas Board of Education, had they approved this document, it would have been published, and then Texas would have bought the books from the publisher. Through pressure from the Discovery Institute, which is the organization Jonathan Wells is affiliated with, and also from Texans for Better Science Education, the publisher finally agreed. There was a fight, okay? They finally agreed to remove these drawings from their final draft of the textbook. They cut that out of there. They didn't have that drawing with the pictures of the different animals and the drawings of the early stages of embryonic development there. Now here's a very telling image. I found this on the website of Creation Ministries International. Haeckel's drawings of those early stages are in the top row. You should probably recognize them by now, that little curly Q, kind of like shrimp, you know. I'm starting to get hungry looking at them. I don't know that I would eat those, but Haeckel's drawings of the early stages there. In row 2, the bottom row, they're actual modern photographs of the real early stages for the same organisms. Quite a difference between what you see in the top row, where everything looks the same, and what you see in the bottom row, isn't there? Another point to be made here is this. While the embryos, even in the photographs, appear to all be basically the same size, in actual fact, this isn't so. Of necessity, the photographs have been sized to about the same proportion with each other, or size, so that you can more easily compare them and compare them to the drawings. But in actuality, the sizes are remarkably varied. The human embryo, for example, on the far right, is much, much bigger than the little fish egg embryo all the way over on the left. Answers in Genesis sadly reports that this recapitulation lie continues to persist in spite of Haeckel's hack job on embryology. They said on their website in an article on Haeckel and the recapitulation idea, while the inaccuracy of Haeckel's drawings became apparent almost immediately. Remember, his contemporaries were criticizing him, and he was regularly being charged as being a fraud. And from what I understand, before I go on here, I read somewhere, I couldn't find it today in time, maybe I'll have it by next week, but I found somewhere, had read somewhere along the line, that he actually went under academic censure at the university where he was teaching because of this. They said, these are fraudulent. You fake these drawings. They're not accurate, and we can't have that our university tainted with that kind of thing, and so some people acted in the academic circles there to censure him because of this. All right. So while the inaccuracy of Haeckel's drawings became apparent almost immediately, they continued to be presented in textbooks, in museums, and the secular media as proof of evolution, even into this century, and they are in the 21st century when they're writing that. Evolutionary biologists who freely acknowledge the inaccuracy of the drawings continue to debate the validity of the theory and its variants. They still think the idea is a good one, even though he faked the drawings. All right? There's no evidence for this whatsoever, but they still go back and forth. I think he was on to something there, the old liar and cheat, whatever. Applications of recapitulation theory, they say, are widely accepted in other disciplines. Notice this, such as linguistics. When kids start to develop language, you see, and they start to learn to talk, these people, some of the linguists, would claim, why, they're going through the evolutionary development that early humans went through to learn to speak overall. Duh. I don't even get that. I mean, if evolution is true, then they had to develop a voice box over time too, I guess. I mean, that's what the larynx and everything else, the muscles and everything involved with articulation and everything else. And a baby born from a human being today, and I believe they were always this way, of course, because I believe in creation, is born with all that is necessary there for it to speak. Going through the development of linguistics, incredible, absolutely incredible. But yet there are people who believe this, you see. Also notice developmental psychology, child psychology. And, sometimes I've had kids who have acted like Neanderthals around me, but you know what I'm saying? That they went through the human evolution in their psychological development, their maturity, and so forth. Oh, come on. The article goes on, to many people, the evolutionary principles underlying recapitulation theory are fundamental truths. See, they believe that evolution, it occurred, it happened, it's a fact, quote unquote, for them. And so the theory, they say, retains its authority in their thinking, even when it requires substantial change or modification in order to persist or exist alongside observable facts. The facts say this, but I've got to change things because the theory's good. Moreover, in recent years, even Haeckel's evolutionary critics have shifted gears and begun to rehabilitate his reputation and his work. Notice I told you earlier about the Wikipedia article on him being an inspiration for Art Nouveau. He's quite all those things that he did. The Leonardo da Vinci lineage of things that he did. He was a scientist, an Olympic swimmer, or whatever else was listed under all those great accomplishments. Phew. Forgiving the liberties, quote unquote, that he took, they forgive him for fudging the information. Some now consider him positively brilliant for manufacturing pictures to prove what he knew must be true. Wow, he's a brilliant fraud. Would have made a great counterfeiter of fake money. I don't know. It's crazy what people believe. Many creationists are under the impression that evolutionists have abandoned recapitulation theory, and that's true. You sort of get the idea that, well, nobody believes this anymore. But its persistence in the educational system, however, testifies to its usefulness even in the hands of those who believe that it has some problems. They still find it useful. It remains a tool to explain evolutionary principles to students and to convince them that evolution is true. I remember working with a young woman and a wonderful, smart, bright girl, and I mentioned this about ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. I said, have you ever heard of that in conversation one day at lunchtime? Oh, yeah, I've heard of that. Yeah, ontogeny, I know all about it. And she kind of explained that she did, And then I started telling her about some of this with Haeckel's drawings being fake. I never knew that before. But see, she had totally accepted it, and of course with that, accepted that evolution is also true. Even though she said she was a Christian and went to church. I'm just telling you. I have read how modern evolutionists have tried to excuse the inaccuracies, how they've tried to excuse the lies and the frauds of their predecessors in their faith. You know, their founding fathers, so to speak. I mean, maybe those early pioneers didn't have the experience of those on the job today. You know, we have a whole lot more experience, and we've got our whole operation is a lot smoother, a lot cleaner. We do things a lot better now. They just didn't have any of that. Maybe they were overly excited. Maybe they were overly confident that they would be the ones to find the proof. Too prideful, maybe. Too zealous, a little bit over the top, you know. The attitude now is, well, today we all know better than that, so... But the idea is still true. But none of that sort of rhetoric excuses perpetuating the lies and perpetuating the falsehoods, known to be falsehoods, almost from immediate, for 10, for 20 years, for 40 or even 100 years. I mean, if there were any scientist in the 1920s, and I recall reading that there were some, who thought that Nebraska man, that primitive man created from a pig's tooth, that was probably the result of somebody making a major mistake, if there was anybody there with any kind of credibility whatsoever, any kind of decency about them, why didn't they speak up and correct their colleagues at the time and say, no, that just can't be true? You got to have more than just a tooth. If there were some scientist who knew that Piltdown Man was a deliberate hoax, where were they? I understand that there were some who said, yeah, we knew at the time that was a hoax. Why didn't you say something? Why did it take over 40 years to finally announce it as being a fake? You'd have saved poor Sir Arthur Keith some time. And with all the sonogram imagery available today and everything else that we have to examine and test babies in the womb, even do surgery and so forth, why do many people still believe the lie that human embryos have gill slits at some stage in their development? Let me simply clear the air on that one, and I mean that literally. Human embryos do not, I repeat, do not have gills at any point in their development. That's just nonsense. The things that might look like slits on these embryos are actually folds of tissue that become parts of the mouth and the chin. They are not gills on their way to supposedly evolve into air-breathing lungs so that when you smack the baby on the butt, he begins to cry. But people use the humans have gills idea to justify abortion. It's no more than a fish. You're not killing a human being. They haven't developed to be a human being yet. And evolution has been used to justify the notion that some humans are better than others. Some are noble, some are commoners, some are higher up on the evolutionary scale. Next time, we're going to see more about evolution's inherent racism. Only healthy seed must be sown. Check the seeds of hereditary disease and unfitness by eugenics. We're going to be talking about that some next week. Thank you so much for listening in. I hope you enjoyed tonight and got some more out of it, so you begin to see the falsehood and the terrible consequences that this idea of evolution has had on our culture, on our society. God bless.